Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we continue to take a look at more of those old school vintage motocross bikes from way back in the day. Now, this featured video that's up and coming is a bit of a nostalgic look back for me personally, because this was one of the first ever bikes that I covered for the VMX magazine many years ago, and this was even before I'd even started up my YouTube channel. So it's a little bit of a walk down memory lane for me, and I hope you enjoy taking a look at this 1983 500 CR Husqvarna. Okay, so as I just mentioned there, this fine looking example of a 1983 Husqvarna 500 CR is actually a bike that I covered some years back for the Australian VMX magazine, when I used to compile regular articles for that publication, which I did for quite a few years, but fortunately for me, I no longer supply them that service. Although, having said that, this featured bike was certainly one of the very first machines I did cover for that particular publication. Now, naturally, this is just a picture slideshow of this bike, and not using any video clips, because these were the days before I actually got into the video side of things and then started up my YouTube channel. But nevertheless, it's certainly a bit of nostalgia for me looking back at one of the first dirt bikes that I did cover, and hopefully you'll enjoy the story and these pictures that accompany the bike. So basically, the bike was restored by this man here, Finlay Wright, who bought the bike back in 1996 from another racer called Davy Lawson, who apparently had this bike just lying around the back of his workshop gathering dust. And when Finlay actually arrived to take a look at the bike, it was certainly in a bad way, covered in rust, and it had all the wrong parts on it, like the wrong exhaust, the wrong plastics, and basically it was a bit of an old dog. But Finlay could still see the potential in the bike, and with a bit of haggling with the seller, Finlay handed over £250, and then he loaded up the bike and headed home as quickly as possible. Now, Finlay's original plan was to do the very basic of repairs to the bike just to get it running, but straight away he had to buy a brand new ignition system for the engine before he could even hear that motor running, which didn't sound great with the engine being a bit rattly and smoking excessively. Although it wasn't too long before one thing then led to another, and no sooner had Finlay fixed or replaced one part than another needed attention. So it was then that he decided that if he was going to have to replace a lot of the different parts on the bike, then he'd just as well do the job properly and do a full restoration on the machine. So as you'd expect, the bike was then stripped right down to its last nut and bolt, and an inventory taken of all the parts that needed replaced, and all the other items that could be salvaged with just a bit of work and elbow grease. Now, to sort out the chassis, this was inspected for signs of any damage, and it was then sent to a local paint shop where it was then bead blasted and then white powder coated, along with both of the fork legs, the swing arm, the shock springs, the fuel tank, and of course the rear torsion bar as well. Now, the big Husky's 500 power plant, less its barrel and head, was then dropped off at Husqvarna dealer Charlie Preston's workshop in Leicestershire, who stripped and then rebuilt the bottom end of the engine with brand new bearings, seals and any other parts that didn't pass quality inspection to be able to be reused on this rebuilt Husky motor. Now, soon after the bottom end of the engine was all restored by Charlie Preston, it was then returned to Finlay, and so he then passed it on to Paul Chiappa at Dunfermline Motorcycles in Fife, where Paul then rebored the motor's barrel and fitted a brand new piston and rings to complete the full refurbishment of the Husky engine. But when these big 500cr Husky motors are all set up and jetted correctly, they're certainly not short of grunt, because I did have one of these 83 500s myself back in the day, and they were pretty damn quick bikes when you got them opened up. But unfortunately, my bike was a lot quicker than the skills I had to handle it, so I just moved it on to let it scare some other unfortunate victim. Now, I'm sure, as you're aware, these big Mega Husky 500s did have a sizable Mikuni carburetor to feed the motor with its fuel, which was through an equally large reed valve block as well. But these Mikunis were certainly good carburetors and highly tunable as well. Now, a brand new exhaust expansion chamber was certainly one of the things that Finlay had to find, because the one that was fitted to the bike was just not correct for its year, and it was in a sorry state. But eventually Finlay did come across this new old stock replacement, which is the original part and absolutely perfect for the bike. Now, also the Husky's original tailpipe, thankfully, was still in quite good condition, so this was just simply dismantled, cleaned, and then repacked with new exhaust fibre, and then it was bolted back onto the bike. Although once the engine was all completed and almost ready to go, it was then given a final coating of heat-resistant black engine paint to finish off what was now a more or less brand new 500 Husky two-stroke engine. Now, when it came to the bike's front forks, these, as you'd expect, were completely stripped down and serviced, and then given a brand new set of seals and fork oil, because the actual stanchions were still in excellent condition, thankfully, so no real work was required on those particular parts other than just a simple clean up. And of course, the fork outers were repainted when the bike's frame and the other chassis parts were refurbished when they were at the local paint shop. But surprisingly though, our 1983 Husky 500 still has its stock original wheels and spokes, which Finlay said only required some cleaning and adjusting to make them good to go. So this was certainly a cost that was saved, not having to try and locate or even replace these original Husqvarna alloy rims with a pair that probably wouldn't have been correct for the bike and wouldn't have certainly looked right. But as you can see, they're still in great condition for the bike's age. And also for 1983, Husqvarna at that time were still using these excellent ITC piggyback suspension units, but of course we all know that these were really Öhlins shocks, just painted with Husqvarna's blue and white livery to match the rest of the machine. And of course, with these being made by the Swedish Öhlins company, naturally these were top quality and absolutely perfect for this twin-shock bike. But again, these suspension units were given the full strip down and rebuild treatment by Paul Chiappa at Dunfermline Motorcycles, who is still considered to be one of the top motorcycle suspension engineers for these off-road classic dirt bikes. Now, when it comes to the stopping power of these 83 500s brakes, as I remember from my brief encounter trying to tame one of these bikes, this rear brake certainly did a good enough job, which, as I recall, also had a magnesium backplate just to help try and keep the overall weight of the bike to a minimum. And here at the front, it was pretty much the same story with decent stopping power. Also, which for an antique braking system on an off-road scrambles bike, these were still quite impressive brakes, even for 1983. Now, when it came to the bike's fuel tank, when Finlay first clapped his eyes on the bike, this fuel cell was certainly in a pretty dire state and in need of some major TLC, but this part again was all taken care of at Finlay's local paint shop when all of the other white parts were prepped and then repainted. And the bike's fuel cell was about as good as new once again after a brand new set of tank graphics were supplied by MXM. Now, the bike seat, as you'd expect, was once again pretty worn out and required some refurbishment, but thankfully the seat base and its foam insert was still in quite serviceable condition. So these were basically just cleaned up and then reused before a brand new Husky seat cover was then sourced and then refitted. And I do remember that these seats were quite firm when you sat your backside down on them, but still very comfortable nonetheless. Now, all of the plastics that were fitted to this bike originally were again in a bad way, full of cracks and generally worn out, so a new set of brand new old stock side panels and front and rear mudguards were then found and fitted onto the bike, which is another reason that makes these old 83 Huskies a good prospect if you're in the market for a fast, reliable open class twin shocker, because there are still a few outlets out there where you can buy new old stock parts for these bikes. And if you can't find original bits and pieces for your 83 Husky, then there are still plenty second hand or pattern parts currently available. Although to finish the bike off, this front number plate plastic was then fitted onto the bike, and all of the bike's cables, levers, grips and handlebars and gasser throttle twist grip are all brand new replacement parts, because naturally you're never going to take to the track with a refurbished bike that still has its old cables still intact. But after Finlay eventually completed the bike, it was almost as good as it left Husky HQ back in 1983. Although when you take a look at this list of brand new parts that Finlay has bolted onto this bike, you can see that he's certainly not scrimped when it came to buying new components for this machine's restoration. And I'm pretty sure that all the work and the money that's gone into restoring this Twinshock Classic will more than likely exceed the actual value of the bike. And so the full refurbishment of Finlay's 500 took him almost 3 years to complete, because as you'd expect, he wasn't working on the bike every single weekend with his busy family life and his other work commitments, but most of the time Finlay told me that it was waiting on parts being delivered and things like the bike's chassis and engine coming back from their various restoration sources. But it still sufficed to say that when Finlay completed the bike, he was well pleased with the way it turned out, although he never actually got the chance to try the bike out on the track, because he sold the bike not long after he completed its restoration, because he had another project lying in the corner of his garage that was in need of his attention. It was a little 1978 TS 100 Suzuki Trials bike that was just lying about in boxes, awaiting the same fate as this 500 Husqvarna. Although certainly it would have been quite good to have a few pictures of this bike prior to Finlay restoring it, because he did say that it was in a pretty battered and bruised state when he first set his eyes on it. But after many late nights and many hours of hard work, Finlay's still made a fantastic job of rescuing what probably could have ended up as a Husqvarna parts bike, although whoever was lucky enough to buy this machine after all of the graft that Finlay had put into it has certainly without doubt got themselves a very nice example of what is still an iconic two-stroke twin-shock racer from 1983. So there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a look there at Finlay Wrights 500 CR. Finlay made an absolute belter of a job of that bike's restoration, and as I said, that bike was actually one of the very first bikes that I covered for the VMX magazine, so it certainly has a few memories for me at that particular machine. So when we come back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, we'll be covering the very last and final round of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's 2023 Championship, and we'll have all of the bikes from around the paddock and of course all of the racing highlights from that final round when we come back to CDB TV. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of these old school vintage dirt bikes right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.